Ok, le doy a empezar.
Cuando tú me digas, Jorge.
Cuando quiera, Borja.
Okay, we start. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go!
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much. Is that all right? Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this session. We are really... Ooh, there seems to be a bit of background noise.
Ya está ok, Borja.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody, and welcome, and thank you so much for joining this session. And we hope it will be a really interesting session. We certainly have an extremely interesting set of panelists who will be able to talk through some of the issues that we're talking about this afternoon or evening or morning or whatever, wherever you are, because I know that one of the benefits of this being a virtual event is that you'll be joining from around the world. There will be an opportunity in this session to ask questions. However, please do put them into the chat box, and I will moderate and ask those questions at the end of the presentations. So the webinar will be exploring the role of people with disabilities and educators of people with disabilities in ensuring education policy is inclusive. It'll look at the SDGs in particular as a framework for engagement with policy, particularly policy that requires multiple ministries and stakeholders to work together for a coherent objective, such as inclusive education. The panelists will discuss frameworks for participation, what meaningful participation looks like, and then we'll also be talking about examples of inclusive education policy and how that can be improved through a collaborative and participatory approach. The objective of this session will be for attendees, for everybody, to understand how the SDGs can provide a framework for participatory decision making and how to ensure that no one is left behind in education. So as I said, it's a shame that we can't be together in Madrid for this conversation, and a huge thank you to UNTHE for their organisation of the World Blindness Summit. As I said, it was one of the benefits is that we get the opportunity to hear from experts from around the world, and this is very much no exception from that. We've got panelists and experts from New York, Dakar in Senegal, Paris, Madrid, to talk about a really important issue. And we have a wonderful group of people to discuss this. There's Jennifer Pai, who is a program specialist at the International Institute for Education Planning at UNESCO, and she'll be giving an overview of inclusive education in the context of the SDGs, with a particular emphasis on learners with disabilities and IAEP's work related to disability inclusive education sector planning. We have Nayara Costa, who is a Senior Sustainable Development Officer for the Division of Sustainable Development Goals at UNDESA, and she'll be giving an introduction into what is good practice, which is a framework that's been developed by UNDESA and UNDP to analyse the quality of stakeholder engagement in the implementation and follow-up of the 2030 Agenda, and how participation can strengthen SDG implementation. Then we have Salimata Bokoum, who is the Sightsavers Senegal Country Director, and she'll be talking about Sightsavers' work in Senegal on inclusive education, the challenges faced in improving policy and the participation of people with disabilities. And last but very much by no means least, we have Isabella Martinez Lozano, who's the Head of Education, Universities and Promotion of Talent at the ONCE Foundation. And she'll be talking about ONCE's strategic approach to overcoming the barriers for inclusive education in an inclusive and participatory way. So this all sounds fascinating, and the last person you want to listen to now is me. So without much further ado, I will pass over to Jennifer. Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Let me share my screen with everybody. Can you please confirm that you can see my screen, Andrew?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to speak at this event on issues of disability inclusive education sector planning, and obviously the focus is on SDGs, but also on other landmark international agreements that I believe feed into the SDG and that we need to be aware of. So I'm going to talk to you today about inclusion as a tool for equity. Now, first of all, before a brief review of some key international agreements that are of importance to the right to inclusive education, I want to take a moment to reflect on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. Article 26 affirms the following: everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. This mandate reminds us that all children have the right to education, and children with disabilities are included in this. Making education accessible for all children is not going above and beyond. The right to education is a fundamental human right, and by ratifying international human rights treaties, such as the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, states assume obligations and duties under international law to respect, to protect, and to fulfill the rights of the child to education. Now, let's briefly examine some key landmark international agreements. Taken together, these landmarks set an important international normative context to national legislation and policy in the area of inclusive education. A key normative framework is the UNESCO Convention Against Discrimination in Education. It was adopted by the General Conference of UNESCO in 1960. It expresses the fundamental principles of non-discrimination and equality of educational opportunities and covers the right to education comprehensively. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child of 1989 was the first comprehensive treaty addressing all rights of children, including the right to education. This was followed in 1990 by the World Declaration on Education for All, which included providing equal access to education for all persons with disabilities. Now, the Salamanca Declaration and Framework for Action was signed in 1994, introducing ideas of inclusion and that ordinary schools should accommodate all children. So that was really the first time that it was expressed so explicitly. In 2006, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was adopted, which clearly stated an obligation to ensure an inclusive education for persons with disabilities at all levels. It was followed in 2016 by the General Comment number 4, which clarified existing ambiguities about what was meant by inclusive education. And a year prior, the Sustainable Development Goals set the target of ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. Now, UNESCO's activities in the context of this normative framework focus on the monitoring of the implementation of the right to education, as well as enhancing the knowledge base internationally and in UNESCO member states on approaches to equity and inclusion. And lastly, an important aspect of UNESCO's work, and in particular, UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning, is capacity development of technical staff within ministries of education in UNESCO member states on planning for inclusive education systems. As evidenced by Goal 4 of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, in short SDG 4, there's growing international recognition of the importance of building more inclusive education systems, thereby contributing to the goal of social inclusion. The UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report, published in 2020 with a focus on inclusion and education, could not have been more clear in its call to action, underscoring the international commitment to inclusion. All means all. Now let's take a closer look at the SDG agenda. The agenda includes a specific goal and targets for education. The wording of the goal represents a considerable leap forward beyond the equivalence in the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals included a goal on education, but simply focused on access to primary education. The goal was to increase the numbers of children enrolled in primary school. Goal 4 of the SDGs goes much further. In other words, it acknowledges that many children face barriers to education, such as girls, children with disabilities, children from the poorest communities, children from linguistic minorities, and so forth. So the SDG goal demands that all children are included in the development of investments to broaden access to education. It also demands that consideration is given to the quality of that education and not merely the fact of it. In order to achieve the goal, the UN has established a number of targets with indicators against which to measure progress. Specifically on disability, these include the target by 2030, building and upgrading education facilities that are disability and gender sensitive. Now, the corresponding indicator is the proportion of schools with adapted infrastructure and materials for students with disabilities. It is important to keep in mind that many marginalized groups of children are excluded from educational opportunities. Exclusion often happens on the basis of gender, language, poverty, disability, ethnicity, and more. And the GEM report states that 68% of countries have a definition of inclusive education, and 57% of those cover multiple marginalized groups. I invite you to take a moment and briefly reflect on what marginalized groups in your country get particular attention within education policies. I want to look a bit more closely at the concepts of equality and equity, which lie really at the heart of the SDG agenda. Understanding the distinction between the concepts is the foundation for building inclusive systems. We can use both approaches in an effort to produce fairness. Equality implies treating everyone the same, while an equity-based approach refers to giving everyone what they need to be successful. Equality aims to promote fairness. Everyone enjoys the same inputs, outputs, or outcomes. For instance, in education, equality means everyone receives the same learning materials, assignments, and are expected to have the same assessment scores. This may imply in some contexts that treating everyone equal does not necessarily mean everyone is treated fairly. Providing equitable opportunities may require additional resources channeled to those who need them with the objective to level the playing field. For some children or young people, this may, for example, mean flexible supports or adaptive environments in order for each and everyone to reach his or her potential. Now, this ties directly to the concept of inclusion as defined by the Global Education Monitoring Report, which is a process consisting of actions and practices that embrace diversity and build a sense of belonging rooted in the belief that every person has value and potential and should be respected. Here, I believe it's important to remind ourselves that inclusion in schools is not a static phenomenon. Understandings and practice of inclusive education across countries are constantly undergoing change. In the past, the concept of inclusive education was mainly associated with children with disabilities, and in particular, their educational placement. Now, the focus is far broader, covering a wide range of learners who may be vulnerable to exclusion. As countries define their approaches to inclusive education, the concept keeps evolving, shaped to a large extent by local and national approaches to its implementation. So what does it mean for education? An inclusive education promotes mutual respect and value for all persons and builds educational environments in which the approach to learning, the institutional culture, and the curriculum reflect the value of diversity. Stated slightly differently, inclusive education should be understood as the means to move towards more equitable systems and ultimately more inclusive societies where people can live together and diversity is celebrated. The term inclusion represents a commitment to making preschools, schools, and other education settings places in which everyone is valued and belongs, and where diversity is seen as enriching. This commitment is not made just once, but continually, as the needs of the children will change throughout their lifetimes and from generation to generation. So what does disability inclusive education mean? Article 24 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was the first legally binding international agreement to mention quality inclusive education. And as countries have continued to make progress on student enrollment, international discussions have shifted towards the quality of education and more precisely on what children are learning in the classroom. However, children with disabilities continue to be vastly excluded from educational opportunities in comparison to other marginalized and vulnerable groups worldwide. And I believe the COVID pandemic has shown that again. Therefore, to meet the 2030 goals of education for all, a special focus needs to be placed on this group of children. As agreed within the Education 2030 Incheon Declaration and Framework for Action, we commit to making the necessary changes in education policies and focusing our efforts on the most disadvantaged, especially those with disabilities, to ensure that no one is left behind. Disability inclusive education is thus an entry point to making sure that an education system reaches all, arguing that what benefits children with disabilities ultimately benefits all children. Now, in line with this international recognition and commitment, the partnership with UNICEF on capacity development on inclusive education sector planning that IEP entered 3 years ago with UNICEF is built on an understanding that progress to reach goal 4 of the SDGs needs to include an explicit focus on the most marginalized learners. This implies developing the skills and knowledge of key stakeholders in an area that is still relatively new for many ministries of education. A survey in 2015 by the Global Partnership for Education revealed a distinct need for capacity development of technical staff. Therefore, the course focuses on developing the foundational understanding of planning for inclusive education systems amongst technical staff and learning about strategies that focus on disability as part of education sector planning processes, as well as new data collection processes to capture children with disabilities within education management information system, in line with the Washington Group set of questions. Now, I wanted to briefly address the different models of educational placement because I do believe they are important. Let's look briefly at these models. We can distinguish between 4 different models: inclusion, integration, segregation, and exclusion. And exclusion refers to a child being completely out of the formal school system, denied his or her right to education. Segregation means the child is placed in a separate school away from his or her peers. This type of placement continues to be very common, especially with regard to education of children with disabilities. This model tends to isolate children from the community and as a result can fail to prepare them for an independent life within the community. Often this educational placement is labeled as special education, implying that children in special education placements are a discrete and separate group with different educational needs from other children. Integration. Integration means that children are all in the same mainstream school. However, they are not placed in the same classroom with the other children. Typically, they are placed in separate classrooms with other children with disabilities. Whenever they are in the same classroom as their peers, the school itself focuses on supporting the child to fit into a standardized classroom. Now, inclusion means that children are all in the same classroom and all needs are met. Importantly, building inclusive learning environments is a continual process, not a series of one-off fixes. It is also not about fitting a learner with disabilities into a non-conducive learning environment. Let me finish by stating that learner disadvantages intersect, and we cannot just focus on those in schools. Inclusion is about leaving no one behind. As an example, Ghana has an inclusive education policy which recognizes the varied learning needs of learners and requires all to address the diverse needs of different groups within a learner-friendly environment for all. Portugal has a comprehensive inclusive education legislation. In July 2018, Portugal passed a law on inclusive education, and recognizing that Article 24 of the UNCRPD and the General Comment call for a transfer of resources from segregated to inclusive environments. So Portugal took a big step towards truly inclusive education, ensuring that all students and their particular learning needs are being catered for to be able to achieve through education and training inclusion in society. So for Portugal, all truly means all. And I'm finishing with that. Thank you very much to all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was a very rich presentation with a huge amount in there. So I'm sure lots of the people who are watching this will be building up questions already. Sure. I think the point about equity, no matter what the barriers that you face are, whether that's because of disability, language, poverty, gender, or other factors, really important for us. And you're seeing disability within an inclusive disability inclusion within that context, embracing all of diversity, I think you said a few times, which I think is a really important thing for us to consider. But also the benefits of disability inclusion for other children as well. I think that's something which is often underplayed and understated. So thank you so much, Jennifer. That was really great. So I'm now going to pass over to Nayara to talk about some of the work that she and UNDP, UNDESA and UNDP have been doing. So Nayara, over to you.
Thank you so very much, Andrew. And can you hear me well? Just making sure. Okay.
Yes.
Great. And I'm really honored to be here today attending this really important event. And many thanks to Andrew and Sightsavers for this invitation to me. I think what I'll be following is more on the global level, because this is where I am based. And I follow the processes related to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals that Jennifer has mentioned as well. I think this event is really, really timely because next week here in New York, but mostly virtually, governments, member states, civil society, stakeholders from all over the world, we are convening at the UN High-Level Political Forum. This is the main space at the UN where the SDGs are reviewed every year. And this is the main space for policies around sustainable development to be reviewed, including national reports that are called voluntary national reports. And I want to stress first the importance of the theme that we are discussing today, that is SDG 4, that is participation of people with disabilities and the educators in achieving SDG 4. And by achieving SDG 4, we are also talking about all the other SDGs. In preparation for the HLPF, the Secretary General of the United Nations, he has released a report, and I invite you to check this report if you haven't, and I'll put the link after I finish. It's a report on the review of the implementation of the SDGs, and SDG 4 is one that is really highlighted in this report, what the Secretary General calls, in terms of the impact of the pandemic on schooling, he calls it a generational catastrophe. And then that even if before the pandemic, if the progress was low, if it was insufficient in terms of the SDG education targets, after the pandemic, we are still facing huge and even more challenges. So the estimate is that hundreds of millions of children and youth are following behind, and that still today, more than 1 year into the COVID crisis, 2 in 3 students worldwide are still being affected by full or partial school closures. And we can, as we were seeing, Jennifer mentioning the impacts in terms of equity, this is really a huge challenge. So what we know from the global level where I am, one important thing, when the SDGs, they were established in a very participatory way. This means that stakeholders, civil society, private sector, the academia, and all local governments, parliamentarians, and all those different actors, they were there working with governments and pressuring for a very ambitious agenda. And not only the agenda and the SDGs are so ambitious, but also they have this call for stakeholders to be part of the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And not only because governments were nice to invite stakeholders, but mainly because it's such a complex and comprehensive agenda that there is no government in the world that can implement it alone. So I'll be focusing on 4 things. So what we know so far in terms of participation and the SDGs, a little bit about the COVID challenge, then quality of engagement, and a little bit about what is next. What we know so far, at the global level, the most relevant, or I would say the more relevant tool that we have to see how governments are engaging stakeholders is the voluntary national reports. Those are reports that governments, they volunteer to present, and they agree to do and develop a process to put together their reports that are presented in July here at the High-Level Political Forum, the HLPF. So they agree to do this in partnership with stakeholders. So what we have seen so far, we did a survey, research between 2016 and 2019, and we saw that there is an increasing trend of mentioning stakeholders in the Voluntary National Review, the VNR report. So 75% of countries reported on the inclusion of non-state actors in governance mechanisms. For instance, 80% of the VNR reports, they mention activities to inform the public about the SDGs, and around 80% of the VNR reports have some information about the multi-stakeholder engagement to nationalize the 2030 agenda. So those are the positive trends, and we have seen also how the references to the different types of stakeholders, this has been also growing. But then we will be talking about the quality at a later stage. Even last year, when governments the impact of COVID was really high in terms of, creating processes for stakeholders to participate, the different types of stakeholders, we could see how governments, they still try to do it, and they even refer to their frustration of being unable to do more to include those stakeholders. In terms of persons with disabilities, for instance, if we take a look at the 2020 Voluntary National Review reports, there were 44, there were 47 of them, and 44 included references to persons with disabilities. And those references, they are made in different ways. So a government will say how they engaged persons with disabilities in the process of implementation of the SDGs, or they will refer to projects, or they will be referring to specific policies, they will be referring to social protection measures. So it's really a broad way that those references are done. And we need also to highlight how the participation of persons with disabilities within the countries and pushing governments to make those references, this is really paying off in the reports that we see here at the global level. But we still see, although we do see some good trends on the voluntary national reports, the reports on how the most vulnerable are being engaged, how the approaches are being tailored to the different sectors, constituencies, how the quality of this engagement is reflected. This is not very clear yet. Then my second point is how COVID-19 has been impacting on stakeholder engagement. And we did a survey later in 2020 and, working around early 2021. And we asked both governments, especially governments working on the voluntary national reports, and stakeholders working around the SDGs on the impact of COVID-19 in stakeholder engagement. And we saw there were some interesting things, including this perception that there were more challenges to engage people and to keep them engaged. But, if you see, almost 70% of the government respondents, they said that because of COVID, the need for participation will increase. So there is this sense that the participation is more, it's more needed than ever. However, there was also this, the sense, or the survey has shown that the crisis is impacting most in those that are more vulnerable. And governments and stakeholders, they were saying that creating systems, maintaining and reaching out to the marginalized and more vulnerable, this is one of the huge challenges that they understand, that they saw. And in terms of challenges, there was the challenge of funding, staffing, capacity, as well, even to deal with the new technologies and the new approaches. And also there was the challenge to the civic space, that even to fight COVID-19, some challenges to the enabling environment for participation, they were brought as well. So I'll go then to my third point. So after seeing all this, we are seeing that there is movement from governments to keep including and reporting on the engagement of stakeholders, but also we are seeing that there's a major challenge coming, including due to the pandemic. And one of the big challenges is that so far, when we talk about stakeholder engagement, we have a lot of stories, I would say. When you read the voluntary reports, they will mention and then we engaged this group and that group and that group, or we did a national consultation, or we did 3 workshops, but it's very hard for us to know the quality of this engagement. Was this good? Was this positive? And was this good for whom? And that's why we worked with UNDP. So UNDESA and UNDP, we partnered. And for a process, it took us 2 years to put together this tool. And we worked with a group of experts in their individual capacity, including Andrew with us today, to try to put together this, what we call this analytical framework that can support in reviewing practices of engagement. It is supposed to be easy to use. It can be used by different types of stakeholders. It can review different levels of participation, including inclusion and communication and access to information, and also the outcomes of the participation. And it can be used in different types of practices as well. It can be used for instance, the participation in a voluntary national review, or in the participation in the development of a policy. So those are just a few ways that this tool can be used. And we see that this can be used also by governments, but by stakeholders themselves. They can push governments to review the quality of their engagement by using this tool and supporting the accountability process. So I'll be putting more information about the tool in the chat box. And I will just finalize my 4th and last point is, so what is next? What we are seeing at the global level, and after 5 years of implementation of the SDGs, there are a few things. One, in terms of the global level and the voluntary national review reports, we need to move from the ad hoc, to the long term. So from, when you have a government preparing a voluntary national review report, you have a lot of action in 1 year, and then after presentation, the energy tends to move elsewhere. So how can we make the process of participation more institutionalized, and what types of structures do we need, and how inclusive they can be? We need, the second point, we need to move now more to check the quality of the engagement and accountability. How can we move just beyond just a few words in the voluntary national review report, and really have tools that show the gaps and the challenges, so we can also improve during the process. We need to know more about what is working, the gaps, the challenges. And I think also stakeholders need to start telling us and governments more like how they want to be engaged, and how this is not working, or what are the specifics that need to change. And definitely we need more exchange, more knowledge exchange, more capacity building. And again, SDG 4 is coming to catalyze the changes and this process of learning together. I want to end by inviting you to follow the High Level Political Forum. It starts next week. We have a series of events organized, including 10 learning sessions we call the SDG Learning and Training, where they'll be covering themes in a very broad sense of the sustainable development agenda. So yeah, my invitation to you, and I'll be posting the links on the chat box. Thank you so very much, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Nayara. Another fascinating and really enlivening and engaging presentation. Really appreciate that. And I think questions about participation, and particularly interested to see you saying about COVID increasing the need for participation and that being recognised. I'd also like to add to what Nayara said, and to reiterate the point about the HLPF. It is a fascinating and important forum with a huge amount of resources and opportunities to see what other countries are doing, and to learn about what's happening in other countries. So please do, as Nayara said, encourage you to join if you're able. I am now going to pass over to my colleague Salimata, who will be giving a presentation about some of the work that Sightsavers has been doing in Senegal on inclusive education. So Salimata, I'll share my screen and then I will pass over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Good morning, afternoon, evening to all, depending to where you are. I'm very pleased to be able to share with you on our inclusive education program. And I would like to thank you, Andrew, a lot for the opportunity. My name is Salimata Bokoum. I'm a Senegal country director. Our country office have been supporting inclusive education since 2011, working with the Minister of Education in particular to provide the necessary support for the enrollment of children with disability into mainstream school. I think the presentation that I will be giving will build on what Naira was talking about, participation, giving concrete example on active participation by people with disability on the education policy design, implementation, and monitoring. I will first of all share about how Sightsavers include or facilitate or work with partnership with people with disability in our different programs. I will also talk about the inclusion of people with disability with the collaboration we are having with government, what role they play, and the successes we have, of course, tackling also the challenges we are facing. I will particularly focus on the implementation of SDG 4 and how, together with people with disability, we were managing or monitoring government implementation. Our inclusive education program, as I said, start to 2011, but in all programs that Sightsavers is implementing, people with disability are playing a major role. I think since the design of the program, we ensure that they participate. We start with situation analysis, and they're playing a major role in terms of identifying gaps and positioning their priority. As far as education is concerned, they were able to participate to the conception of the program in order for us to agree priority and strategies on how best children with disability can be enrolled into mainstream schools. In the implementation phase also, Sightsavers is working a lot with OPDs members. This is to ensure that at the local level and the national level, they fully participating. Through the education program, we have focal points at national and local level. We establish a mechanism to collect feedback that is helpful in terms of reorienting the program if need be. Through the implementation also, the capacity building they receive enable them to advocate for strategic issues such as funding at very local level. I can give several examples where we work, where people with disability, through their advocacy and awareness raising, were able to position themselves and then to be listened by local authorities that decided or committed to create budget lines, specific budget line to support children with disability education. They're participating to debate at the local level, participating to the commission, raising education, children with disability education rights. With the design and the implementation, of course, we were talking about also the monitoring, and they fully participating to that and the evaluation process. in terms of, and this include, of course, children with disability, parents with disability, with children with disability, in the design, the implementation, as I said, in the monitoring and evaluation. But another participation, which is very meaningful to us, is the participation of children with disabilities themselves. Through our inclusive education program, they're able to voice, they raise their voice. And we were doing that through two mechanisms. The first one is the child-to-child support we establish, where children with disability are able to mentor or to be mentored by a child in order for them to express their need, priority, and to facilitate their integration into school and classrooms. Another mechanism to make sure that they're participating is the inclusive clubs we managed to establish. These clubs brought together parents, school authorities, and children with disabilities themselves. By participating to those clubs, they're able to raise their voice, they're able to talk about their needs and priority. And this is a kind of mechanism that prepare them in decision-making process. Because from the club, we want to make sure that they also participate to children parliament, for example. Next slide, please, Andrew. I think the facilitation we were doing to make sure that people with disability participate in our programming, from the design to the monitoring and evaluation, open the communication with government. And the second point I will be talking is how we were ensuring inclusion of people with disability in the work we were doing with government, specifically talking about the design of education policy, as well as education sector planning. In Senegal, site savers and others organizations are pushing for government to elaborate inclusive education policies. We face a lot of challenges, including the change at decision-making process, with the minister being changed every 2 years, we can say that. But the participation and the communication we open between government and people with disability enable us to progress. Minister of Education established a task force, which include several technical departments at Minister of Education, but also members of the OPDs, which is the National Federation of People with Disability. They were able to participate to those debate in designing the policy document. Another participation, which is very meaningful to us also, is when the Senegal was, the Minister of Education was designing its education 10-year plan. Participation, active participation, I may say, of people with disability enabled for the first time to include in the 10-year plan, which is called PACE, indicator, specific indicator on children with disability education. That was the first steps. And this led to the revision of the result framework to include those indicators. And the last report, the National Education Report 2019 to 2020, for the first time talked about children with disability education. We were able to see information from the national level on how the Minister of Education is enrolling children with disability into the national education system. In terms of the policy and the sector planning education in general, these are the key elements that I wanted to share. But once this policy or the plan have been validated, an important role also is being played by parents of children with disability. They are a key actor in ensuring the implementation of education inclusive education program in countries. This is through several activities. They actively participate in identifying children with disability. We know that perception can be a challenge. Even if the school exists, a lot of parents did not accept to leave their children go to school, particularly those with intellectual disability. Parents of children with disability play a major role in sensitizing families for their children to go to school. They're playing major role, as I said, in disenrollment, but also in advocating at very local level because they belong to the inclusive task team that are established in the different intervention area. And within those task force, they were able to raise awareness on the right of children with disability for education and to succeed in having on board as a department, as a ministry's department. I can give the example of the department in charge of food in schools, which decided to establish in the different inclusive education schools a canteen for children with disability to access to the food. A lot of awareness raising by parents also led to local council to take in charge the transportation cost, because when we create the demand, children were responding, family was responding, and we start seeing children coming far from the schools, and transportation became a challenge. Because of the work and the sensitization done by parents, this issue was resolved by local council members. There are a lot of other examples I can provide it in terms of how parents participate in the education of their children, or how they are raising awareness, how they participated in coordination committees to play a key role. One major fact also is the organization they managed to do, because parents of children with disability created an association, but created also a link between those associations and the parents association at national level, because they understand that to talk about or to advocate for the children's rights, it would be better to do it through a platform which is talking about general education, which is talking about education for all. And that was the reason why they creating those links, articulating their advocacy work with the National Parents Association advocacy work. All this participation led to a lot of results, a lot of successes. But I said also we face a lot of challenges. But to tackle those challenges, OPG's influencing work are focusing now on how to make Ministry of Education scaling up the education program. It's in some intervention region, and they want to see those education generalized at national level. We are talking about 14 regions in Senegal. To do that, and to share the fact that they actively advocating for that, they were able to meet the Minister of Education himself. And that debate was for them to share the concern they have in the education, children education. But they also tackle strategic elements such as funding for inclusive education. They were talking about equity for education, because if we were supporting, government is supporting for now some regions, other children with disability in other regions are being left behind. So that discussion was how to make sure that all children in the 40 region access to education. They were debating on issues such as data disaggregation, because they understood that by disaggregating data, Ministry of Education will be able to identify, to have a big global understanding of the situation be able to analyze the gap and take the right decision in terms of increasing resources, I mean financial resources, but also human resources, in order to take into account children with disability education. Next slide, Andrew. So while doing that participation, that communication, to make sure that education become a reality, we of course focus on the SDGs 4. SDGs 4, and in that work also they're playing a key role. People with disability are members of the CSO working group, which has been established in order to monitor government implementation of SDGs. What is interesting in this work is they are able to communicate with government, planning directorate in particular. In Senegal, and I think in most of the African region, alignment have been done between the development plans and SDGs. For Senegal to be able to implement SDGs, the Plan Senegal Emergent was reviewed. Key indicators have been identified. The first observation we did was those priority indicators at national level did not include disability. People with disability participation in the workshop done with national statistics was determinant. We were able to identify those gaps and to provide concrete recommendations which have been taken into account. Among the priority indicators that Senegal have now, disability is very well placed. As member of the civil society working group, they also participate to the contribution report. Senegal participated in the High Political Forum in 2018, and civil society did work on the contribution report. That report includes contribution from people with disability. And I'm very pleased to hear Naira saying, you know, we were expecting more, what next after the reporting process. In Senegal, not only people with disability participate to the designing the report, but after the forum also, when the minister come back, we did push for a workshop for them to tell us the recommendation and the way forward. This led to the government proposition to include the CSO, including people with disability, in the national monitoring mechanism that have been established by the Ministry of Planning and Finance. We continue the advocacy work. In 2020, Senegal will not be presenting, but they participate, they prepare, they report on SDGs progress. We had the opportunity to review that report and to make some contribution. The processes here in Senegal is we are having the dialogue, but the dialogue is an opportunity for us also to point out the challenges. And I think the communication we open between the government and CSO, including people with disability, is leading to concrete changes. Senegal became a champion due to the fact that CSO were able to push for that. And by becoming a champion for the IDC, which is the Inclusive Data Charter, we will be monitoring concrete action that they will implement to ensure that disability will be included. So a lot of challenges, as I said, which can be summarized around perception that the authorities have, or the misunderstanding of the concept. And I think Jennifer were talking about the importance of understanding the concept of inclusion, but also the capacity issues, because we need a critical mass if you want people with disability to occupy the chair and be able to make the necessary advocacy. Another challenge may be accessibility. In all this debate, workshop, advocacy or influencing work, it's very important they access the content of what is being discussed and being able to provide their contribution. So we're also working on those aspects. And now I think inclusion is becoming a reality in Senegal. 2 weeks ago, the President of the Republic, Mr. Macky Sall, sent a letter to the National OPD network for them to identify 2 members as to participate to the commission in charge of governance during within this peer review, the African peer review mechanism. This is showing change in perception, but this is also sharing, you know, change in policy, and we hope will be translated in program, specifically education program, to make sure that any child with disability will be left behind. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Oh, no, thank you, Salimata. I think fantastic presentation there, and explaining to us, I think, the way in which inclusive education and the concept of inclusion can work all the way from the school through to the national level framework, and the role that the SDGs plays there. So thank you so much for that, Salimata. I am now going to hand over lastly to Isabel, who will be talking a bit more about the work that UNTE have been doing in their approach for overcoming some of the barriers around inclusive education. So Isabel, thank you so much, and over to you.
Muchas gracias, Andrew. Muy buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Yo voy a completar algunas de las propuestas, las ideas y las estrategias que han planteado ya mis compañeras de mesa. Me gustaría dar algunas pinceladas sobre la educación inclusiva y luego contar muy brevemente algunas de las estrategias que estamos implementando en España de la mano de la Fundación ONCE. Quiero empezar recordando algo que está siendo ya un reclamo, yo creo que en todo este encuentro mundial, y es que en la sociedad del conocimiento la educación es probablemente el elemento más empoderante de las personas. Por eso yo creo que más allá de nuestro sexo, nuestro color de piel o nuestra discapacidad, lo que realmente va a determinar nuestro grado de inclusión o exclusión en nuestras sociedades realmente va a ser el grado de educación que seamos capaces de alcanzar. Y por eso nos parece especialmente relevante el cumplimiento del objetivo 4 de la Agenda de Desarrollo Sostenible. Yo quiero también esta tarde recordar aquí ese movimiento continuo del pensamiento de Paulo Freire, que nos enseña precisamente que la educación es verdaderamente una práctica de libertad. Pero una persona no puede tener libertad en ninguna de sus dimensiones si la educación no es inclusiva y de calidad. Y para que todas las personas tengan esa libertad y autonomía, la educación se debe de garantizar en igualdad de condiciones y sin restricciones. Es importante recordar que la educación inclusiva implica no solo acceso, implica acceso, pero también permanencia y oportunidades de progreso en igualdad de condiciones. Y también implica y comprende desarrollo de metodologías docentes y contenidos accesibles que tengan en cuenta a las personas con discapacidad como parte de la diversidad humana. Se ha dicho ya aquí esta tarde, la pandemia del COVID-19 ha puesto en evidencia la fragilidad del derecho a la educación inclusiva y ha mostrado de nuevo el impacto de la desigualdad en la educación, dejando atrás a la población más vulnerable. También en esta pandemia del COVID hemos visto cómo se han acelerado el ritmo de los cambios pendientes, como la transformación digital en el ámbito educativo y de la educación superior. Y esto plantea también nuevos retos para la inclusión. La transformación digital puede ser una gran aliada para la inclusión, para personas con discapacidad y especialmente para discapacidad visual, pero también puede ser un elemento que genere mucha exclusión si las tecnologías digitales no son accesibles. Aunque se han producido muchísimos avances y progresos en leyes y en políticas públicas que avanzan en la inclusión educativa, nosotros creemos que son necesarios aún cambios estructurales y de concienciación para avanzar sobre todo en el derecho y la garantía a la educación superior. Nosotros tenemos a lo largo de muchos estudios que hemos realizado en los últimos años suficientes evidencias que nos indican que el estudiantado con discapacidad viven la etapa de transición hacia la universidad con muchísimas inseguridades, con muchísimos miedos, y eso es lo que genera que haya un abandono escolar temprano tan alto entre la educación secundaria y la educación superior. Y hay muchísimas barreras para el acceso a la educación superior que hay que ir eliminando. El año pasado, en el 2020, la UNESCO presentó su informe de seguimiento sobre la educación en el mundo, sobre inclusión y educación. Y además de que nos alertaba de los grandes desafíos de los sistemas educativos del futuro, la UNESCO también en este informe nos advertía ya de los grandes obstáculos que aún existen para la educación inclusiva, sobre los que creo que es importante detenerse, sobre todo para tratar de erradicarlos. Ese informe nos hablaba de que el 17% todavía de la población mundial no asiste a la escuela, y nos hablaba también del alto número de países donde todavía existía la educación segregada, la educación separada. Nosotros en España también tenemos todavía ese problema y tenemos un 20% de personas con discapacidad que estudian en centros especiales. Ante todos estos obstáculos, ¿qué es lo que podemos hacer? ¿Qué es lo que hemos planteado nosotros que podemos hacer? Bueno, yo quiero remarcar que en mi opinión todos tenemos parte de responsabilidad, todos los actores tenemos algo que hacer, aunque evidentemente la mayor responsabilidad esté en manos de los estados. Creemos que hay que avanzar en leyes y normas que garanticen la inclusión. En España se han cambiado en estos últimos años todas las leyes, las grandes leyes de nuestros sistemas educativos. Y parece increíble, pero todavía desde nuestra plataforma de personas con discapacidad, desde el CERMI, hemos tenido que presionar mucho para que estas leyes estén en sintonía con la Convención de los Derechos de las Personas con Discapacidad y garanticen ese derecho a la inclusión. Creemos también que tenemos que exigir a las administraciones educativas y a los operadores tecnológicos que esa transformación digital que está ya produciéndose en las aulas se realice con las garantías adecuadas para que nadie se quede atrás. La digitalización es un gran riesgo para la inclusión si no se tiene en cuenta la accesibilidad digital. También creemos que tenemos que exigir reformas en las metodologías docentes y de evaluación y que se respeten las adaptaciones curriculares y se ofrezcan los recursos de apoyo necesarios. Sobre todo desde la crisis del 2008 hemos visto cómo se han reducido los recursos de apoyo en muchos de nuestros sistemas educativos. Y sobre todo, muy importante también, tenemos que hacer un seguimiento para comprobar los progresos, los avances y ver realmente lo que funciona. Lo contaba muy bien nuestra compañera Graica de la DESA, de Naciones Unidas. Es muy importante comprobar los progresos y ver qué es lo que funciona en los países. Por último, algunas ideas sobre lo que estamos haciendo desde Fundación 11. Desde Fundación 11 lo que hemos hecho es convertirnos en unos grandes aliados de las administraciones educativas y de las universidades para avanzar en la inclusión, con estrategias conjuntas, con ideas conjuntas y poniendo a disposición de las universidades y de las administraciones recursos adicionales que desde la Fundación 11 ponemos en manos de las administraciones. Nuestro objetivo prioritario es que las personas con discapacidad lleguen a la educación superior. Esa es la meta, ese es nuestro objetivo prioritario. En España, más de la mitad de las personas con discapacidad se quedan en el paso anterior, se quedan en estudios secundarios. Por eso nuestro reto en la próxima década tiene que ser que la mayoría, que más del 50% de nuestro alumnado llegue hasta la educación superior. Para eso estamos trabajando con 3 estrategias decididas. Por un lado, estamos trabajando en el acceso, con programas que promueven el tránsito hacia la universidad, para evitar el miedo, para reducir las inseguridades, y para eso estamos trabajando de la mano de las universidades con los institutos de educación secundaria y con los servicios de orientación para que este alumnado no se quede por el camino y llegue a la universidad, reforzando sus capacidades, reforzando su talento, haciéndoles perder el miedo, con programas bastante interesantes en ese sentido. En segundo lugar, estamos trabajando en la promoción, es decir, no solo que lleguen a la universidad, sino que sean capaces las personas con discapacidad cuando llegan a la universidad de promocionar, de evolucionar, de progresar académicamente. Y para eso hemos elaborado guías, ofrecemos recursos de apoyo, asesoramos en las adaptaciones curriculares que hay que hacer a algunos estudiantes, a algún estudiantado con discapacidad, y sobre todo hemos desarrollado una gran cantidad de programas, de becas y de ayudas para el alumnado con discapacidad cuyos estudios suponen un coste importante para sus familias. Y en tercer lugar, nuestra tercera línea de acción está dirigida a favorecer el tránsito de la universidad hacia empleos técnicos y cualificados. Nuestro objetivo no es solo que las personas con discapacidad lleguen a la universidad, sean buenos informáticos, sean buenos médicos, sean buenos profesionales, sino que cuando terminen la universidad tengan oportunidades de trabajar en empleos cualificados, en empleos para los que se han preparado. Y para ello tenemos también una serie de programas de prácticas académicas remuneradas, donde le pagamos a los alumnos empleas prácticas laborales en las empresas. Tenemos programas de movilidad internacional para que puedan desarrollar sus estudios y sus competencias lingüísticas en el extranjero, y otra serie de becas con las que estamos trabajando con las empresas para que ese tránsito hacia el empleo sea también más fácil y las personas con discapacidad que tienen la suerte de llegar hasta la educación superior y tienen la oportunidad de desarrollar su talento, tengan también la oportunidad de tener un desarrollo profesional con éxito. Esas son solo algunas de las cuestiones que estamos desarrollando. Como es muy tarde, no quiero alargarme mucho más y prefiero que haya oportunidad para el debate. Y simplemente, por último, invitarles a una iniciativa, a un espacio que pusimos en marcha hace casi 10 años ya, y es el Congreso Internacional sobre Universidad y Discapacidad. Cada 2 años, desde Fundación 11, de la mano del CERMI, de la Conferencia de Rectores Española, de la OEI, del Ministerio de Universidades, organizamos un congreso internacional sobre universidad y discapacidad. Y en estos congresos, periódicamente, lo que venimos haciendo es precisamente compartiendo ideas, estrategias, acciones, planes para poder favorecer la inclusión en el ámbito universitario, para conseguir universidades cada día más inclusivas que nos lleven hacia el último de nuestros proyectos, y es generar un sello de calidad para las universidades inclusivas que estamos promoviendo desde la Agencia Nacional de Evaluación, para que podamos ir entre todos, entre todas, tejiendo ese camino de universidades inclusivas que hagan más fácil el tránsito para las personas con discapacidad hacia la educación superior, porque estamos convencidos, estamos convencidas de que la educación superior es el mejor pasaporte al empleo y, por tanto, a la inclusión en esta sociedad del conocimiento donde se nos mide por nuestra capacidad y por nuestro talento. Muchísimas gracias.
Well, thank you so much, Isabel. Another fascinating intervention, and I think really rounded off what has been a very full set of presentations. I think we've covered everything from pre-primary all the way in that case to university education, and we have covered everything from policy setting to the impact on individuals. So the policy setting at the global level, indeed. So thank you so much, and particularly talking about how we can move from a normative framework to one that actually impacts on the lives of people in education. It's time now for a question session. So if any of the attendees, if you have a question for any of the panelists, please do feel free to put it into the chat box. and I will moderate that. I can ask the questions. We do already have a couple of questions, so to start off the discussion. The first one is from Shalika. Thank you very much for your question, which is how effective is inclusive education when you consider activities outside the classroom, such as co-curricular activities and sport? Jennifer, could I come to you first on that one, if you have any thoughts to share with Shalika?
Yes, I believe the non-formal education is something that we haven't looked at sufficiently in the context of our focus on formal education. I believe the two go hand in hand. And as far as communities are concerned, there is a lot that is being done by non-governmental organizations in this area. And I believe a stronger link through parents with schools could I think bring forward the issues of learning for children with disabilities in terms of the quality as well. It could be complementary in a way that we have not collected any data. I believe that's one of the biggest challenges we're facing is data collection of what non-governmental organizations is doing, and how many children with disabilities are not in school, and what they are doing within communities in terms of learning and non-formal activities. So yes, I would say it's a really important addition that we need to learn more about.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Isabel, I don't know whether you have anything to add. Do you have any experience from Spain of any of these questions on extracurricular and sports activities?
Sí, es una pregunta interesante porque efectivamente la educación inclusiva significa incorporar transversalmente la inclusión en toda la dimensión académica y universitaria. Nosotros hicimos el año pasado, hace 2 años, perdón, un informe sobre cuál era la práctica de las estudiantes universitarios con discapacidad en los deportes universitarios, y nos dimos cuenta que la participación deportiva era muy baja, y era muy baja porque no todas las instalaciones deportivas eran accesibles, porque en las competiciones deportivas universitarias no se contaba con las personas con discapacidad. Y a partir de ese informe hemos ido haciendo algunas estrategias con algunas universidades, tratando precisamente de promover el deporte inclusivo y que también los estudiantes con discapacidad tengan la oportunidad de desarrollar su formación deportiva. Y esto hay que empezarlo desde las escuelas. Nosotros desde la Fundación 11 tenemos también un grupo, una federación de deportes para ciegos, y es desde esa federación desde la que hacemos diversas actividades en los colegios, formando también a los profesores y a las profesoras de educación física para que en sus actividades no olviden el deporte inclusivo. Me parece muy importante que el deporte no se olvide de la actividad académica, y sí que estamos trabajando también para intentar no renunciar a la disciplina deportiva.
Andrew, we are muted.
Apologies. It has to happen at least once in every Zoom call. Thanks for the warning. Now, as I was saying, it's a growing area, I think, is the conclusion that can be brought from that. So thank you so much. There's a really fascinating question from Darong in Cambodia, which I'll read out. It's targeted initially at Salimata, but I think Nayara, you might have some thoughts as well on this. So Darong has said, at this time in Cambodia, only the Ministry of Education is considered to be the one who addresses the needs of and issues to achieve SDG 4. Other ministries are not interested in joining forces to address other issues to make inclusive education real, whilst we really push for it, since we understand that only collaborative work between different technical ministries can address the holistic issues of inclusive education for children with disabilities. When talking about disabilities, also says OPDs are focused on wheelchairs and ramps, and they're also interested in livelihoods rather than inclusive education. and parents are busy with earning incomes to support the economy for the family. So education for children with disabilities is not considered their issues, but the school's issue. So what recommendations and clues, he asks, can we give to advocate for more active participation of different stakeholders to achieve SDG 4? Salimata, can I go to you first for that?
Yes, thank you, Andrew. I think I fully agree on that comment, and the collaboration within the Ministry of Education and with other sectorial ministries is determinant if you want to achieve inclusive education, which is an holistic approach. In Senegal, different departments, as I said, are discussing together on how to support children. This intersectoral collaboration is being seen between the Minister of Education and the Minister of Health, for example, because when you are enrolling children with disability, the certification process includes medical consultation, and the Ministry of Health is handling that part to make sure that pedagogical response, appropriate pedagogical response will be given to children. The Ministry of Health also is supporting in terms of social program they have. Children with disability benefit from the scholarship from Ministry of Health and Social Welfare. They also been enrolled with through this big program that the government have, which is called the Equal Opportunity Card. All the children identified in the inclusive education program have access to that card, which is facilitating also access to services such as health and other social services. So I do believe that the collaboration is very relevant, very important if you want to achieve that. Thank you.
Thanks, Salimata. Nayara, do you have anything to add to that from your experience?
Thank you so much, Andrew. One thing that comes to mind is, like, Jennifer mentioned this at the very first beginning when she said the SDGs, they refer to all, and all means all. And I think the 2030 agenda, the SDGs, they give us this framework that can help us working with governments to remind them that they have committed to this very comprehensive agenda. SDG 4 is part of it, including education of all children is part of it. And more than that, all the goals are interlinked. So it does, you might be trying to tackle poverty and thinking that you are doing this, but if you are not addressing education, you are not. So I think this, the connected nature of the 2030 agenda is something that we usually play in our favor when we are trying to advocate for additional support for some of the goals. At the global level, I think the role of networks is really, really important, and to keep reminding and keep bringing the information and the gaps. In the years moving forward, especially due to the impact of COVID, I think education will be really, really high on the agenda. I know that there, every goal, all the goals are under challenge, but I think the urgency that the education sector is now will be really key. So yeah, my message is really keep pushing, keep showing the gaps, keep showing the data, keep showing the interconnected nature of the different issues, because this is making the difference, and though this message is coming through, especially at the global level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nayara. Jennifer, Isabel, do you have anything to add on this question?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question that we are facing in our training programs. I mean, we do have a mandate towards ministries of education, but the issue of disability is intersectoral, and I believe Nara was saying, it's also expressed in the SDGs. And it's a challenge, I believe, that we're all facing. How do we address that? And I see it in the training courses that training courses will probably have to also include technicians from other ministries. But we have to start small to make sure that even within the ministry there is a joint understanding of what we mean by inclusive education, and not only in the inclusive education department or in the special needs department, as it may be called in a lot of ministries. So the idea would be to think of capacity development initiatives that target several ministries, technical staff within several ministries, and not just the Ministry of Education. We see that as a challenge, but it's definitely something that we should probably reflect on more carefully.
Thank you. I think there's time for just one more short question. I think which was for Isabel, which was about excuse my poor translation here, but around the technological tools for the inclusion and better access to training for students with visual disabilities, and how can technology help students to access education on equal terms. I thought it was a really important question. Thank you, Monica, for sharing that. So Isabel, could you share some thoughts on this?
Sí, yo por la experiencia de la 11 y por nuestra experiencia de seguimiento directa con el alumnado con discapacidad visual en España, puedo decir que la tecnología es la gran aliada de la inclusión. Y de hecho, todos los adelantos tiflotécnicos y el hecho de que las grandes compañías, como nos contaban el pasado viernes, Microsoft, Apple y las grandes compañías tecnológicas estén apostando por la accesibilidad tecnológica, es una garantía para que las personas con discapacidad visual puedan contar con mayores instrumentos que le permitan un aprendizaje más rápido, más creativo, mejor. Pero siempre tiene que haber un apoyo tiflotécnico, una alfabetización, una formación, y cuando eso se da y se da adecuadamente, el caso de España es muy significativo, porque el fracaso, el abandono escolar temprano en España se acerca al 15%, y en el caso del alumnado ciego llegan a la universidad la mayoría de los estudiantes. Solo el 8% de estudiantes ciegos no llegan a la educación superior, y eso tiene mucho que ver con el soporte de la tecnología y con lo que la tecnología sirve de aliado para mejorar las técnicas de aprendizaje. Pero eso sí, tenemos que ser muy vigilantes con la accesibilidad y sobre todo hacer muchísimos entrenamientos tiflotecnológicos para que la gente cuente con la alfabetización necesaria, porque la tecnología avanza muy rápidamente y las aplicaciones cambian cada día hay nuevas aplicaciones, y es muy importante estar al día, porque si estás al día realmente son unos grandes aliados para avanzar.
Well, thank you so much for that. Any additional thoughts from any of the panelists? Otherwise, I think we are fast running out of time, and thank you so much to everybody who put their questions in. Apologies that we could only get to some of them, but I would like to say a huge thank you to everybody for joining this session. We hope that you found it interesting and useful. I certainly did. And a huge thank you to all of the panelists, to Jennifer, Nayara, to Salimata, and to Isabel for taking the time to share your experience and your understanding of these issues with us at this summit. I wish everybody a really great afternoon and evening. I think unless we have some panel, well, we may have some people from the East Coast of the US, so if so, have a good rest of your morning as well. But yes, the joy of a global session. But I wish you all the best, and a huge thank you again to the panelists. A huge thank you to ONTE for their organization. A huge thank you to the interpreters. You've done a fantastic job. as always, in this and making this as accessible to everybody as possible. And I wish you all well. So muchas gracias a todo and adios.
Gracias. Thank you very much.
Gracias. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Adiós.